Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Venezuela's special diplomatic envoy, Alex Saab, was extradited to the U.S. on October 16 after being detained and imprisoned in Cape Verde for 491 days. His crime? Helping the Venezuelan government evade crippling U.S. sanctions to procure fuel, medicine, and food for Venezuela's food assistance program, upon which 6 million Venezuelan families depend. His detention has set a dangerous precedent in violating diplomatic protocol and has kicked off a new and disturbing phase of the U.S. hybrid war on Venezuela and other countries facing unilateral economic strangulation from Washington. Joining me to break down the significance of this case is Zoe Alexandra, journalist at People's Dispatch and co-host of the weekly show Give the People What They Want. Zoe, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Rania.
It's so good to have you on. And I just, for our listeners and viewers, a quick reminder to those who are watching, you can listen to every episode of Dispatches anywhere you get podcasts, and I've included links in the description. And for those who are listening, you can watch every episode on the Breakthrough News YouTube channel. Be sure to subscribe. And of course, if you like listening to the show, you can support us at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And now for the topic at hand. Zoe, reading the mainstream media's coverage of the Alex Saab case, he's really portrayed as kind of like getting what he deserves, because their version of what's happening is pretty much just the State Department version, which is that he's this corrupt and greedy Colombian businessman who has been siphoning money off of Venezuelans, who was, he's also been accused of money laundering for the evil dictator, Nicolas Maduro. Let's put aside for a moment the absurdity of America accusing anyone of stealing from Venezuelans, as they literally have the country under an economic siege and are siphoning off their state resources to give it to the opposition that they prop up. But I guess, it would be good to start off by maybe explaining to our listeners and viewers the real story here. So let's start with what happened on October 16. How did Alex Saab end up being extradited to the U.S., and what's the latest with his case? And then we can go from there to talk about some more details about exactly who he is.
Yeah, of course. So on, Saturday, October 16th, the news broke kind of mostly across social media that Alex Saab had been extradited to the United States. And after the fact, hearing from his family members, his wife particularly, who spoke to a rally in Caracas on Sunday, we found out that they weren't even notified officially. His wife, Camila Fabri, she never was able to visit him in Cape Verde when he was under house arrest, but his sister was able to be there. And according to his wife, what happened is that she went to his residence, which was normally surrounded by 100 guards, police, etc., and they weren't there. And she asked what happened, and they said, they sped up the extradition process. So this is a situation where, they were not notified. There was no, it's just an example of really what happened at every step of this case, which is that due process was not respected. International law was not respected. And so, looking back a little bit from, the extradition, which happened on October 16th, before that, essentially, Alex Saab had been detained on June 12th, 2020, on the island of Sal in Cape Verde at the Amilcar Cabral International Airport. He was on his way to Iran, and his plane, stopped at this airport to refuel. It's a diplomatic mission, pretty long. They had to refuel. And when he got there, he was arrested by Cape Verdean authorities. And that day, there actually was no arrest warrant. There was no Interpol order. There was nothing to say he must be arrested. It was purely a request from the United States. The day after he was arrested, Interpol, clearly at the service of the United States in this case, issued a very quick red alert arrest warrant for Alex Saab. But this is a day after he's been arrested. So it's important to point out that from the beginning, there were these irregularities. Not even to mention that Alex Saab was on official diplomatic business to Iran, where, as you mentioned before, he was, because of his role as being part of purveying, cheaper food and medicine as part of Venezuela's many public programs which sustain millions of families. He was going to Iran to negotiate these deals, and he was on official business. And so that's another violation that happened in his arrest. And essentially, from that day on, June 12th, 2020, he was held for 491 days in Cape Verde. For a while, he was in prison. And then after a very long legal battle, he was released into very restrictive house arrest, where he, as I mentioned before, surrounded 24 hours a day by hundreds of around 100 guards. He was consistently denied access to medical care. He was tortured. His family members weren't allowed to see him. His wife and he has 2 young children. They tried to go to Cape Verde and they were called persona non grata, so they were unable to visit. So, he was in house arrest, but essentially he was in a smaller prison that in that apartment.
It's completely wild. Just everything you're saying, the fact that the U.S. can, the fact that a country at the behest of the U.S. can just like arrest a diplomat, and we can get into the legality of that. But first, I guess, I want to ask you, who is Alex Saab? Because the U.S. and its sort of media mouthpieces have really gone out of their way to almost strip him of his diplomatic status by repeatedly referring to him as just a Colombian businessman. So can you explain what is his relationship to Venezuela? And of course, this goes back to the fact that he was on a U.S. sanctions list. He was added to that U.S. sanctions list in 2019, a few months after the U.S. puppet Juan Guaido had declared himself the president of Venezuela. So how did he end up on the U.S. sanctions list in the first place? And what is the U.S. claiming? What are their accusations against him?
Yeah, I mean, he is technically a Colombian businessman. That's not technically wrong, but he is a lot more than that. He is from Colombia, but as of 2009, he started to do kind of business, negotiating trade deals on behalf of his company, and in favor of the Venezuelan government to, help get construction material for their different projects. Because of course, also it's not a crime that there are people doing business with Venezuela. But then, in 2018, because of his very close relationship with the government, working a lot with different programs, he was clearly, skilled at helping get these important deals to a country that has been under economic siege. Of course, as of 2014, with the Obama's decree calling Venezuela a threat to national security, it's very important that Venezuela is able to, get these trade deals that get them the crucial supplies that they need. But as of 2018, Alex Saab was designated a special envoy to Iran and to Russia. And it's important to point out that these are 2 very key strategic allies of Venezuela. While it's being under siege by the United States, it does need trade partners. A country cannot exist and cannot survive if it does not have relationships with other countries, able to import food and medicine to be able to sustain the people. And so Alex Saab, in that sense, was a member of, was working with Venezuela as the special envoy, also in African countries. And so he was establishing important contracts for importation. And, in 2019, when we really see an increase of these sanctions of, people across the board being slapped with sanctions. Of course, in 2017 and 2018, we see the financial sanctions, across the Venezuelan bank and the oil industry. But many people who have in any capacity worked with the Venezuelan government, if they're members of the government, or in the case of Alex Saab, who is recognized as a diplomatic envoy, but was playing that very crucial role of getting these contracts, is in these sanctions. The U.S. says that he was responsible for overvalued contracts, and that he was benefiting from negotiating these contracts for Venezuela, which is interesting because then when he is arrested, we see figures like Iván Duque saying that this is a crucial victory against narco trafficking, which is interesting given that Iván Duque is actually proven to be involved with drug traffickers in Colombia, which is the country that exports the most cocaine in the world. And so other things that the U.S. has claimed about Alex Saab is that he's a profiteer orchestrating, I'm reading a direct quote because I think it's quite impactful, a profiteer orchestrating a vast corruption network that has enabled former President Nicolas Maduro and his regime to significantly profit from food imports and distribution in Venezuela. And this really seems like a sick joke because it's the United States that has, as you mentioned, strangled Venezuela and has forced it to, drop its food imports by almost 40% because of the sanctions. And who is this affecting? Who is it affecting that Venezuela is unable to import this much food? Of course, the people. So it's quite interesting that they really focus in on someone who is doing a very important role for Venezuela in this moment. I think that's pretty much what we can get from their explanation of him.
No, it's utterly shocking. I mean, to say former president like that, and then to, of course, like accuse people. I mean, it's all complete hypocrisy, and I do want to get to some of that hypocrisy, but I wanted to touch on the issue of legality here. Because the Venezuelan government is arguing that the detention and extradition is completely illegal because, like you mentioned, they made him this diplomatic envoy, which should give him the diplomatic immunity when he's traveling around the world trying to set up these sort of bilateral relationships with other countries. And, the Venezuelan government also says that the unilateral sanctions are, in fact, a violation of international law. And then there's the issue of the fact that Cape Verde doesn't even have an extradition treaty with the U.S., and there was clearly pressure applied from the U.S. on this country to extradite him. And of course, there's also the issue of whether it's definitely not legal for the U.S. to prevent Iran and Venezuela from having bilateral relations. I mean, it's just like running around acting like international pirates and bullying people completely unilaterally around the world. Like you mentioned, he was detained while refueling his plane. So, I mean, and then there's the issue, of course, like I mentioned, of sanctions. And we just saw that a UN Special Rapporteur released a report concluding that the sanctions on Venezuela are basically political. They're completely political. The intention behind them is absolutely political, that they undermine human rights and that they violate international law. Can you kind of elaborate on some of the illegality of all this? Because, I mean, the U.S. is prosecuting somebody who's not even a U.S. citizen. They literally kidnapped him, brought him to the U.S., and they're prosecuting him inside America. Like, do they even have jurisdiction to do that?
Yeah, I mean, the extradition in itself is that's a topic that's quite big to touch on. But I think there's several key aspects at play here. As you mentioned, he was a diplomatic envoy. So the first level of illegality is that, diplomats should enjoy a certain level of diplomatic immunity. That's one illegal element there. Cape Verde does not have an extradition treaty with the United States. So under what grounds are they doing this extradition? And it's important to point out that actually several international multilateral bodies pointed to this and said that this is not legal, this is unconstitutional. The Economic Community of West African States on several occasions, in several instances, demanded that Cape Verde release Alex Saab and suspend all extradition processes. And they said that it was not only, illegal, they even ordered reparations to be paid to Alex Saab. And there's a legal dispute emerged whether Cape Verde was violating its commitments to the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, by not fulfilling their ruling that they must release Alex Saab. The UN Human Rights Committee also called on Cape Verde to stop the extradition, also called on them to fulfill, for example, his requests for medical treatment, which they also did not do. Many say that when he was being extradited, they thought that finally he was going to be given medical care because he had been demanding to be transferred to the capital to be given medical care. So these are all, a lot of illegal elements of this. And, even the charges that they've pressed on him, which are profiting from overvalued contracts, money laundering. They really have no grounds on which to support these claims. Alex Saab himself said that this was clearly politically motivated and, a move to force Venezuela to submit and to overthrow Nicolas Maduro. It's interesting to see what the reaction has been from mainstream media. They believe that this is going to be a step that's going to, that they're taking Nicolas Maduro's right-hand man and that they're going to force him into submission and to tell all these, to give up information about the Venezuelan government to the U.S. authorities. So even the way that mainstream media is framing this, it's clear that they have a political motivation, which is that they want to use leverage against Venezuela. It's not about corruption, which it never is when the U.S. is talking about corruption, because we only have to look at other states in the region to see that they don't really care about when corruption is happening and when people are actually being harmed. So I think we only have to look that far to understand the illegality of this.
Yeah, and it's actually, when you mentioned the mainstream media, the Israeli media takes it even further because Alex Saab is also of Lebanese origin. So anyone Lebanese who's like pro-Venezuela or Cuba or like a Chavista in Latin America is automatically labeled a Hezbollah operative in Israeli media. So like Israeli headlines are all like, America extradites Hezbollah operative working for the Venezuelan government. So like they take it to even the next level. And of course, there's the whole wild conspiracy that America and Israel have fabricated of like Hezbollah and the Venezuelans and Iran are like trafficking drugs through Latin America. But all that said, you mentioned a few things that stand out to me. Like you mentioned him asking to be transferred to the capital for medical care. During his detainment in Cape Verde, there was constantly, people advocating for him were saying he was being mistreated. And now, his wife at this rally in solidarity with him in Caracas, read a letter that he had written. And in it, he mentioned, I don't have the direct quote in front of me, but basically I'm paraphrasing. He stated that he has no intention to commit suicide. So should he end up dead and they say it's from suicide, just preempting people to say it's a lie. I'm not going to kill myself, nor am I going to cooperate with the U.S. authorities. I don't have to, which suggests to me that he fears for his life. So my question for you is his life in danger in this situation? Was he being tortured during his imprisonment? And is there fear he might be in the U.S.?
Yeah, so many details have come out, since his extradition. I think the letter read by his wife is extremely moving. It's very, sad to watch because she's, of course, in a very difficult state, but, she mentioned that she's very grateful to have all the solidarity of the Venezuelan people. And yes, the element that she mentions that if anything happens to them is quite concerning. In further kind of information that was released about his detention, during the time that he was held in prison, he was tortured. It says that he was hit in the teeth. He received other kind of beatings. And it is, as I mentioned before, kind of the language they use to talk about why he is being extradited. I just want to read a direct quote from Associated Press. American authorities have been targeting Saab for years, believing he can unlock the mystery of how Venezuela has been selling gold and tankers full of crude oil in violation of U.S. sanctions. They also believe that he holds numerous secrets about how Maduro, the president's family, and his top aides siphoned off millions of dollars in government contracts for food and housing amid widespread hunger in oil-rich Venezuela. So just that quote alone kind of gives a hint that what they plan to do is get information from Alex Saab. How do they get information? We know the means and the methods that is used by the United States. In the letter, it also mentions that he has no intention of cooperating with Venezuela, and with the United States, and that he will always remain faithful to Venezuela, which kind of suggests that in the case that he were tortured and would be pressed to give information about all of the things that I just mentioned from that AP quote, that he would not comply. And it's important that they're putting emphasis on this, before these hearings start, because they clearly think that that is the motivation. The mainstream media has showed that is the motivation. And so, we have to believe them when they say it.
I mean, yeah, obviously there is the issue of the countries like Venezuela and Iran have mechanisms to make sure their people don't starve and get around sanctions. And essentially the US wants to know, how are you doing this? Because we want to make sure it stops, which just shows that this is an entire operation to further starve the Venezuelan people. I mean, it's so incredibly sick. But I'm wondering if you can maybe explain a bit of the consequences, the immediate consequences of this, which is the fact that it has basically thrown a wrench into the negotiations between the opposition, the Venezuelan opposition, and the Venezuelan government, which was set to take place in Mexico. Um, and I'm curious, I saw some people alluding to this, but I'm not sure myself. Is there a pattern of the US derailing such negotiations? I'm not suggesting they did this just to do that, but it might, of course, be like a benefit on top of everything else for the US. Is there a pattern of the US kind of throwing obstacles in the way of the opposition, the Venezuelan opposition and the Venezuelan government coming to negotiations? And is this basically putting a stop to that completely?
Yeah, so Alex Saab had also been named part of the official delegation of the Venezuelan government to these negotiations in Mexico, which I think was a tactical move by the Venezuelan government, of course, to kind of implicate him in this another, diplomatic instance. And so, yeah, after the Venezuelan government released it, saying that Alex Saab had been extradited, shortly after, Jorge Rodriguez, who is the head of Venezuela's mission, part of these delegations, did announce that they were suspending their participation in the upcoming cycle of these negotiations. This is, and this was done to show their complete protest of what happened. And when you look at the social media, the Twitter of Leopoldo Lopez, Juan Guaido, who are, of course, the leaders of this far-right opposition, which historically had joined these, which in a historic moment had joined these talks, before had not participated, they're celebrating. And they're saying that this is another win against corruption. And, I don't know if they use the drug trafficking language, but definitely against corruption, which they love to throw around. And so it is quite concerning, because one of the key parts of these dialogues is not only the participation of the opposition in the upcoming electoral process, which will take place on November 21st, which for the first time will likely have electoral observation by the European Union, but also that these talks were, one of the key goals was to, call for the gradual lifting of sanctions. And this would have been, extremely huge for Venezuela. Now, I mean, it begs the question, did the opposition ever have, any interest in furthering this? I think in many senses, we can see that the opposition has been incredibly weak in the past couple of years. I mean, now the US is barely even acknowledging Juan Guaido as the interim president. They kind of struggle to use that language. But it is quite concerning, because this was a very promising dialogue process. Of course, this process did not benefit the United States. I don't think they were really excited about, the opposition they had invested so heavily in over the past, 6-7 years since the first kind of like massive uprisings in 2004, not massive uprisings, but this moment, which was a turning point for the opposition, where they were able to start gaining this support in 2014. I don't think they're happy about it. I don't know. I don't know if they calculated that this would be the direct impact of the extradition. But of course, this is not going against their interests, which is to maintain maximum pressure on the Venezuelan government. I think we were seeing a bit of that tension kind of lessening with these dialogues, because they were, very promising in terms of the opposition maybe getting to a place where it would call for the lifting of sanctions, which would be for the good of the Venezuelan people.
And I really quickly just want to kind of give people an idea of what we mean when we talk about the devastation that sanctions have wrought on Venezuela. And it's been pretty catastrophic for the country economically and for the average person. You've had this huge wave of people leaving the country, something that the US likes to almost celebrate, but it's just because they need to go find work. A lot of them end up in Colombia, like working in really poor conditions, or like living on the streets in some cases. And it's also incredible just coming from the US, because from what I understand, the West is not only they've frozen Venezuela's central bank assets, but the UK has actually refused to allow Venezuela to access its own gold reserves. So they've essentially stolen Venezuela's gold reserves. And then on top of that, they've if I'm like, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Venezuelan oil company, certain assets of it that are inside the US have been taken by the US and basically given to the opposition, which the US backed opposition, which has siphoned money off of it. I mean, it's completely insane. Meanwhile, the results on the ground in Venezuela are quite devastating on the economy, on people's daily lives, causing fuel shortages, electricity cuts. But I wanted to ask you specifically about the CLAP program, which is one of the things that the US accuses Alex Saab of I don't know, it's this weird thing. They accuse him of siphoning money off of the program, but they've actually been trying to destroy this program, which is the food assistance program that I think something like 80% of Venezuelans depend on in some capacity. So can you talk about what is the CLAP program? What is its importance, and what has been the US attack on it?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier that the US, when they impose these sanctions, their goal is to starve the people, their goal is to cause this misery, and they don't want these countries to kind of come up with mechanisms to get around what is the economic impact of sanctions. And Venezuela was not going to sit around and wait for the sanctions to be lifted. And so they've come up with a lot of different mechanisms to make sure that the people aren't feeling the worst impact of these sanctions. To make sure that there's a basic amount of support given to the people. So, for example, the CLAP program was created in 2016 in a moment of rising sanctions, of course, right before the really horrific sanctions of 2017 on the financial market, on the oil company, on the oil producing sector. But still, when a lot of officials were receiving sanctions, and they could see that this was a trend that was only going to get worse. And so the CLAP program, which is the local committees of supply and distribution, is a program that essentially guarantees a basic box of food, which includes oil, grains, protein. It varies on what the specific contents are, depending on the region and what department is responsible for it. But at a very subsidized price and to families. And so, not only is the CLAP program, providing these essential food baskets to the people, but also in many places, because it's, directly delivered to the families, that it requires a certain political organization. So the CLAP has also been used to organize people, to make sure that in people's communities, they are, staying in touch, that the people are going directly from home to home, which, Venezuela its revolution is really also based in this grassroots organization of the people. And so the CLAP has also served as kind of strengthening the revolutionary process in the bases, making sure that the communities know, who needs support, who needs assistance, and making sure that they receive it. Currently, there are over 6 million families that receive these CLAP boxes, which is, millions of people, because it's 6 million families. And, they do provide this very basic lifeline that people were unable to, not only buy the food because of lack of money, but also because of the complete difficulty of importing food. There was, in some cases, scarcity. And so this program is extremely crucial in bridging those divides, of making sure that people are getting directly the food that they need to survive.
It's amazing that the US, I mean, it sounds like such an amazing program, and the fact that the US would try to, because the other thing that the US and that, of course, media repeats is they're like, this program it was a way to control Venezuelans. They use it to force them to vote for them by bribing them with food. That's the way that the US twists around what you just described. But the broader case of Alex Saab, of course, does set a precedent for a complete violation. I mean, it just destroys diplomatic protocol. And we'll have to wait and see like how that plays out moving forward, because it kind of gives other countries a green light to just say diplomatic immunity doesn't matter. It's a completely rogue move by the U.S., but it's also not the first time the U.S. has detained someone for supposedly violating their unilateral sanctions. I'm thinking, of course, of the Huawei, the executive detained in Canada on behalf of the U.S., who was just released a couple of weeks ago after being detained for quite some time. But I guess like my question for you is, what does this mean for a country's abilities to get around these unilateral starvation sanctions? And are there any other cases that come to mind of the US like acting like pirates and just like kidnapping people in other countries to enforce their sanctions?
Yeah, of course, the case of the Huawei executive is extremely concerning, and it is, really good that she was able to be released, because it's a case that really makes no sense. Why should the U.S. be able to, force a country to detain someone when their only crime is, trying to work to get around sanctions and even just to do business? As the big capitalists of the world, why are they so against people doing business, engaging in trade relations? I think as we're seeing the tensions of the U.S. trying to resist this multipolar world, they're getting, increasingly more desperate. They clearly can't, force Venezuela into submission through sanctions, even though they kept trying. There are indicators to show that the Venezuela's economy is, little by little improving. The situation right now in the country is extremely different from what it was in 2017 at the height of these sanctions. There are, multiple reasons for this, but of course, Venezuela has strengthened its trade relations with Iran. It has strengthened its trade relations with Russia and China. These are key allies to resist kind of this unipolar, forced world where, Venezuela for a while was really dependent on the U.S. oil market, but there were some really historic achievements throughout the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw the Iranian oil tankers going to Venezuela to help them with their refineries, to help them, overcome this very challenging moment. So there is kind of this turning point, and I think that as the U.S. sees that it's slipping, that its grip is slipping a little bit in the region, it's going to start making more and more unilateral moves. I think in terms of extradition, there have been several cases of, I'm thinking, of course, of the case in Colombia, where they've used the extradition treaty with Colombia to extradite many political prisoners. There's a very famous case of a political prisoner, Simon Trinidad, who has been held in a maximum security U.S. prison for over 10 years. He is, accused of being a huge drug trafficker, of all the other crimes that they want to press on him. And he was exempt from the peace. They did not allow him to benefit from the peace process, wherein he would have been tried by Colombia's justice system. They've also used the extradition treaty to extradite a lot of paramilitaries. And one would say, oh, that's nice that, they're going against the paramilitaries. But a lot of people have also complained that the extradition is, in complete violation of national sovereignty. And for example, in the cases of looking for justice, the U.S. basically allows these people to get away with their crimes because they never have to see real justice in their own country. So I think the system of extradition really needs to be questioned, because it is a fundamental violation of national sovereignty, and that these, for example, in the case of paramilitary criminals, they should be tried in their own country so that justice can be done and that the truth can come out. And then, of course, when we see cases of Simon Trinidad, of Alex Saab, this is just the U.S. getting away with what it wants to do, and unilaterally deciding who gets due process, who gets shut in a maximum security prison with no chance of seeing any sort of real trial and real justice.
Yeah, I was curious, one thing that comes to mind watching this play out is that this targeting of Alex Saab and this sort of intensification of the U.S. war on Venezuela happened under the Trump administration, whose Treasury Department was the one that actually added Saab to the U.S. sanctions list like like we talked about, just months after Guaido appointed himself president. Yet the persecution of this guy has continued like fully under the Biden administration. Sanctions have continued without any reprieve under the Biden administration. So I guess my question for you is, so far, is there any difference in policy between the previous administration and this one?
Sadly, it seems that they're pretty dead set on maintaining Trump's sanctions. All of these really extreme sanctions, like the 2017 set of sanctions, 2018. Then, of course, everything that happened in 2019, from Juan Guaido to the failed military coup in April. That all, of course, occurred under Trump. But it set, it raised the bar in terms of sanctions. And Joe Biden has done nothing to lower that bar. They have not, for example, freed up Citgo, the Venezuela's U.S.-based oil company, which, as you said, was handed over to Juan Guaido, which they proceeded to kind of run into the ground, which was one of Venezuela's biggest assets, which now is almost failing because of their misadministration and just siphoning the money away. And yeah, nothing has really been done to reverse these sanctions, to lift a little bit of the pressure. And they've continued with very similar rhetoric. They have not gone back on saying that Venezuela, that Nicolas Maduro is illegitimate, that he is a dictator. They have not gone back on, all of these other policy moves that even if it was Trump who put them forward, who really took the action, there is necessary effort that needs to be made to better the situation, and that's really all Venezuela is asking for. Lift the sanctions. We don't need anything else from you, but just allow us to breathe and allow us to try to get out of this difficult moment that they're facing.
It's the double standards are amazing, and you alluded to them earlier, but I'm just thinking of Colombia, which you already mentioned. You mentioned Ivan Duque was like talking about, oh, this is like a big win against narco trafficking, when he's literally tied to narco trafficking, and his country is one of the biggest sources of it. So it's just so incredible how the U.S. and its like right-wing regional allies are always lecturing about democracy and human rights in Venezuela, when not too long ago there was protesters being gunned down by U.S. trained security forces in Colombia, something we rarely hear about. So just to kind of pivot for a moment, I'm curious, what is just like an update on the current situation in Colombia, and from beyond, and just to move a little bit beyond that too, or broaden it out, what is the role of a country like Colombia in the region? Like, we know why Venezuela is targeted, right? It refuses to submit to like U.S. capital, to U.S. interests, to U.S. imperialism, unlike some of its neighbors do. Whereas Colombia is essentially an arm of U.S. imperialism. So I guess those two things, can you update us on the situation there on the ground when we're talking about activism? And then second, like, can you give people an idea of what is the role that Colombia plays in sort of conjunction with the U.S. across Latin America?
Yeah, I also just wanted to add that one of the U.S.'s other key right-wing allies in the region, Honduras, the president is actually implicated in a massive drug trafficking case in New York. His brother is currently in prison, and he is, accused of participating in, large-scale drug
so
trafficking.
Weird. I haven't heard. So weird. I haven't read that in the New York Times or like.
Yeah,
The Washington
it doesn't
Post.
seem to
Really
make the main newspaper, but it's and of course they supported Juan Orlando Hernandez after massive electoral fraud. Talk about election legitimacy. But going back to Colombia, of course we covered the very 10-week long national strike where over 80 people were killed, gunned down by members of the police, paramilitaries, etc. Really horrific situation. And it did not really move the U.S. to change its policy at all towards funding Colombia's military, towards the many different programs it has of military training, exchange. And I also want to highlight, this human rights crisis that has been happening in Colombia has also affected Venezuela. Not to mention the different border tensions that have been, but just last week, two young Venezuelans were, you know, detained by civilians. They were 12 and 15 because they were accused of stealing food. And shortly after that, they were essentially, you know, kidnapped by armed men and gunned down immediately, publicly lynched. So this is the situation in Colombia where, you know, youth of very, very young, it's a really disturbing video, to be honest, to see that they are, you know, just these young people killed for stealing, just because they're Venezuelan, just because they, you know, are stigmatized by the people in Colombia. So this human rights crisis where you see just complete lawlessness, where the Colombian state has just allowed paramilitary groups, criminal groups to essentially be the new sheriffs in town. We saw a lessening of this, you know, very complicated situation of violence with what was happening with the peace talks. There was this sort of moment of hope in Colombia where, you know, maybe peace is on the horizon. There won't be as much criminal and paramilitary control of the territories. And we've just seen a massive reversal of this situation. Over 1,000 human rights defenders, social leaders, and ex-combatants of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia have been assassinated since 2016. We saw the brutal repression of the national strike in May, June, July. The situation is really one of concern in Colombia, and that every day, if you follow different, you know, local Colombian media, you'll see that a day doesn't go by where a human rights defender, an environmental activist, isn't murdered. Again, this of course does not make mainstream media, and it's even hard to cover because every single day there's a different person who's assassinated, whether it be by local paramilitary groups, whether it be that by the police or the army. And it's a really, really concerning situation. And the government of Ivan Duque, while it likes to, as you mentioned, kind of point fingers and name call against Nicolas Maduro and the government of Venezuela, it does not only not protect the Venezuelan migrants that it loves to say that are in Colombia. It loves to remind the world that there are, you know, a lot of Venezuelan migrants living in Colombia. What it does not say is that over 362 Venezuelans have been murdered in Colombia just this year. In the last 5 years, the number is 1,933. What is Colombia doing to protect Venezuelans in Colombia? What is it doing to protect Colombians in Colombia? It is not doing anything. So that's on one hand. And then I think, you know, this kind of gets to it, but what is the role that Colombia plays? I mean, it's a crucial role. It is, you know, always there for the United States. It is constantly instigating. It's interesting to note that in many of the official statements given by authorities in Venezuela about the extradition of Alex Saab, they also hold Ivan Duque responsible in the Colombian government for being one of the principal kind of instigators of this process. And they, you know, in every moment they have, you know, supported, they've hosted Juan Guaido. I mean, the border concert in February 2019, you know, 1 month after Juan Guaido, you know, declares himself president, was held in Cucuta, Colombia, where Juan Guaido actually crossed the border with help of paramilitaries, proven, and there's, you know, photo evidence of it. So they've, you know, provided logistical support. You know, then of course we see that paramilitaries were trained in Colombia and then tried to conduct an invasion of Venezuela. So in every single aspect possible, you know, Colombia is opening itself to the United States for any sort of moves it wants to make against Venezuela, whether it be paramilitary training groups, whether it be that their foreign policy completely is against, you know, what should be, you know, their brother nation. Venezuela and Colombia are intrinsically linked. They were both liberated by Simon Bolivar. They have very similar culture. Their people, you know, there's 4 million Colombians in Venezuela. Right now, there's, you know, hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans in Colombia. And there's a historic tradition of collaboration, but Ivan Duque has decided to, you know, favor the United States. It loves receiving this unconditional support interned from the United States, the military aid, the complete political support when it's committing massive human rights violations. And so it will turn against its neighbor. It will pursue this policy of aggression. It will, allow, for example, its paramilitaries to get into border skirmishes with the Venezuela's army. And so there are just so many examples of how now every single account it will bend to the United States will. At one point, I think the U.S. ambassador to Venezuela was stationed out of Bogota. So it's honestly endless, to be honest.
Geez, I mean, I remember, I think it was the previous president of Colombia had referred to it as proudly as the Israel of the Middle East, which we always like to make fun of, but I think it's a really apt description in the sense of Colombia really just being this arm of American hegemony across the region. But I think it maybe also speaks to the fact that the U.S. does have to prevent Colombia from turning into Venezuela. I mean, if they're so close and intrinsically linked, there's always that potential of that sort of revolutionary spirit finding a way to win in Colombia. Maybe I'm just, being naive and too idealistic. But that said, I wanted to turn to the country of Nicaragua as well, which has upcoming elections after this attempted U.S.-backed coup back in 2018. That was quite violent, but of course, as is usually the case, it was portrayed in the U.S. as though it was legitimate, and this, beautiful uprising against a dictator, Daniel Ortega. It's always sort of the same playbook over and over again. But the reason I bring this up is now the U.S. is about to pass, or the U.S. Congress is about to, or I'm not sure if they already have, passed these sanctions, these very crippling sanctions, the Renacer Act, as they call it, against Nicaragua, which would see Nicaragua subjected to some of the sort of economic siege warfare. It already is. Nicaragua is already under sanction, but not to the extent that Cuba and Venezuela are. So now we see the U.S. trying to sort of impose that same style of economic warfare on Nicaragua. Can you talk a little bit about what this would mean for Nicaragua, especially as it stands as, I think it seems to be at least one of the most stable and peaceful countries in Latin America. I mean, what would these sanctions do if they're successful?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is definitely preparing for an eventual victory of Sandinismo in the upcoming elections on November 7th. As you mentioned, you only have to look at Nicaragua's neighbors to kind of understand how the U.S.-backed countries are faring. Extreme levels of violence, extreme levels of poverty, extreme levels of corruption, forced mass migration of, millions of people from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. And, Nicaragua, I think, especially during the pandemic, has shown that it is an alternative model, and that, for example, by favoring food sovereignty and supporting small farmers, it can actually, create different models, and that its policies are creating a more stable and better life for its people. And now that the elections are coming up on November 7th, the U.S. is kind of panicking because, their violent coup attempt did not work. Now people are maybe supporting the government even more because they overcame that period. And now during the COVID-19 pandemic, they're seeing just what the impact of having a pro-people government really is. They're not, suffering as much as their neighbors. Of course, there's, always, improvement in, situations, but Nicaragua is in a much better situation. And they want to prevent that. They don't want this model to exist in Central America. They don't like Nicaragua being a potential ally. It is an ally of the other nations in Latin America. And, ahead of these November 7th elections, many people have been anticipating, the Renacer sanctions, but also what could happen after these elections. Will it take a move that it's taken with Venezuela of calling these elections illegitimate? What kind of moves will it take? Currently, the president of ALBA TCP, which is the platform of states of the Alliance of Our America, the Bolivarian Alliance of Our America, which was, of course, started by Hugo Chavez, and is an important state platform, political platform of countries in the region, who are not part of the U.S. hegemonic bloc. And the president, Sasha Llorenti, is currently was in Nicaragua for several days, to do this important work, meeting with people from the government and strengthening this relationship, because they know that Nicaragua is the next target. It already is a target, but it's definitely going to be hit with, different measures from the United States. There will be sanctions. What other moves they will take, we'll have to see. But of course, as in any case, it will be the people who will suffer from the sanctions. It will be the people who are, will have their access to food impeded. But I think what's also interesting to see, and we actually have covered this in People's Dispatch, is the model of food sovereignty that Nicaragua has been quite insistent on. There's a very large network of small producers who are producing their own food. I think they're set to have better conditions if these economic sanctions do get worse, because they have kind of this very grassroots and especially focus on the rural sector, very strong support. And so, in any case, it will be a horrific impact. Hopefully won't be as bad because of, as I mentioned, this kind of strong grassroots base that they have. But the U.S. is not going to give up so easily, and they will definitely try to use any means necessary to force Nicaragua to submit.
And, just to bring it back around to Alex Saab here, I think it's really important to situate, to contextualize these things as all being a part of the same war. I mean, what we see, we don't talk about it like this in the US, but I mean, this is a long time hybrid war by the US on Latin America to basically shape the continent in the way it wants it to be. So can you talk a little bit about, in the context of kind of everything that you've just said about Nicaragua, Colombia, Venezuela, about what we mean when we say hybrid war?
Yeah, I mean, the concept of hybrid war is very useful in understanding the current imperialist assault on many countries across the world, almost all of the global south. The hybrid war, refers to the fact that you no longer need necessarily troops on the ground, although in many cases there are, to kind of force countries to submit to your will. And so the U.S. has developed a very, what they would believe is smart and interesting method to kind of force countries to submit. And this involves, of course, sanctions, unilateral coercive measures are a key aspect of this hybrid war. Force a country into starvation, force a country into obeying your will, suffocate the country until it really has no other option. Sanctions and unilateral coercive measures are a huge aspect of this. Then, of course, media war. I mean, if you turn on any mainstream Latino news network in the United States, they're going to say Nicolas Maduro, the dictator, every other word. So try to manipulate the discourse about really what's happening in these countries, because once people know the truth about what the Bolivarian Revolution actually means, once they know the truth that, for example, in Cuba, you are guaranteed healthcare and education, they're not going to be supporting the discourse of the United States. When people are fleeing their, neoliberal countries run by kind of drug lords and corrupt leaders, they are also running from places where they're not able to get jobs, where they're not able to get education, where they're not, able to survive. But if you see the example and understand what Cuba means, what Venezuela means, it really kind of rattles with that consciousness. And so the media war has been huge. And not only, of course, in the United States, but also, the television networks within these countries. I mean, trying to use social media, looking at the case of Cuba, for example, with the July protest, because it was really almost one day of protest in Cuba, the massive kind of deployment of the social media strategy, the hashtag SOS Cuba, the manipulation of bots, the lot. These are, tools made in the empire for the empire. They have all of the sophisticated resource to manipulate algorithms to, make sure that what happens on social media, what the mainstream media is reproducing, favors their discourse. And, of course, I think looking at the case of Venezuela, the military option has never been off the table. Just even looking at, the failed, botched invasion of Venezuela that happened during COVID-19, where we saw the heroic Venezuelan fishermen who are part of the militia capturing U.S. mercenaries in
Yeah,
Venezuelan waters. I
I
mean,
remember
this
that.
happened very recently, in, what was it, May 2020? This is, I mean, I think the pandemic time, we kind of forget about all these different things that have happened, but this is part of the hybrid war, to put fear into the people. The fact that the military option has never been off the table means that Venezuela is also living in a constant state of, we don't know what's going to happen next. Could there be a military invasion led by the United States? That's always an option. I mean, we just saw the revelations from Bolivia that there were high-level members of Janine Áñez's government trying to convince U.S. mercenaries, thousands of them, to come to the country after Luis Arce won the elections by a huge margin in October 2020. So the fact is, I mean, all of these different things represent that the U.S. and its allies, its local allies, will go to any means necessary to ensure that these countries are in a state of submission, to make sure that national production is not a reality, to make sure that they don't have the ability to lift their countries out of submission, out of the situation where all they serve is to give natural resources, to give up their wealth, and to, make sure that education, health, dignified housing, employment, these are not realities for the people. I think, of course, immigration into the United States plays a huge part of this. They need that workforce. They need people who are, essentially desperate to survive. All of these are part of the hybrid war on Latin America, which so many countries suffer from, and many are taking bold steps to kind of break through and fight back against.
Absolutely. And just to note what you just mentioned about Bolivia and Janine Áñez trying to basically hire mercenaries. If I'm not mistaken, she actually had reached out to the people that were essentially hired to kill Jovenel Moise in Haiti. The same, like, it was like the Colombian mercenaries, and I think maybe a couple of them may have been Venezuelan. So that just goes to show, how the U.S. just works so closely. The right wing, like the right wing Latin Americans and the U.S. really work hand in hand. I mean, those are their local partners on the ground, and so a
Based
lot
in
of it
Miami.
based in Miami, and a lot of it emanates from Colombia, Venezuela, people from Cuba, as we know. That said, I guess this is probably a good endpoint here, Zoe. But before we go, I wanted to know if you can maybe point our listeners and viewers to where they can learn more about the Alex Saab case, and perhaps how they might be able to get involved and maybe pressuring their local government officials against prosecuting him.
Well, always, check out peoplesdispatch.org. We've been covering Venezuela. Many of us have had the opportunity to be on the ground in Venezuela, speak to, a lot of these grassroots activists that have been day to day resisting U.S. imperialist aggression. And, there is an international committee demanding the release of Alex Saab that was created shortly following his arrest. I know that there's people organizing, across many countries as part of this campaign, linked with, of course, the solidarity efforts with Venezuela. So definitely encourage people to check out, be informed, read People's Dispatch, listen to Breakthrough News, and don't trust mainstream media, but read it with a grain of salt. I actually learned a lot from reading the AP article. I mean, they tell a lot more than they want to.
Yeah.
And they give away, really what their main motivation behind these things is.
Absolutely. This is why media literacy is so important, so you can read between the lines. But Zoe Alexandra with People's Dispatch, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.